Have you ever believed something so confidently until one moment shattered that belief? For decades, the Western world has taught us that business is about logic, precision, and profit. Nothing more. We were told compassion has no place in the boardroom, that kindness slows progress, that emotion is a liability. It's a silent doctrine we've all accepted, that to win in business, you must harden your heart. Yet, what if I told you? There's a nation quietly proving the world wrong. A country where empathy doesn't weaken productivity, it multiplies it. Where kindness isn't the opposite of power, it is power. That country is the Philippines. For years, a subtle insult has hovered in global business circles. It's not spoken aloud, but whispered between lines of investor reports and corporate meetings. Filipinos are kind, yes, but can they lead? The tone is always polite, the smile diplomatic, but the implication stings. It's as if the world decided that being compassionate means being soft, that hospitality equals submission, that warmth cannot coexist with excellence. This quiet prejudice has lingered for decades, shaping how foreign investors, CEOs, even educators view this nation of more than 100 million hearts. And then, something remarkable happened. In 2019, during a high-profile leadership summit in New York, an American CEO named Michael Andrews, a man who had built, sold, and rebuilt 3 multi-million-dollar companies in Silicon Valley, stood up before a room of global executives and said, "I learned more about leadership in Manila than in any Ivy League program." The audience laughed politely. They thought he was being generous, perhaps nostalgic. But Michael wasn't joking. What he said next silenced the room. The future of business will be written by nations that still remember the human soul, and the Philippines has never forgotten. Those words, coming from a man known for his cold, data-driven success, sent ripples through the corporate world. What could have possibly happened in Manila that transformed a Silicon Valley mogul into a believer in compassion? The answer wasn't a seminar, a book, or a consultant. It was the people. The everyday Filipinos he worked with. The employees who didn't just deliver results. They cared. They cared about their colleagues, their clients, their communities. They built companies like families, not factories. They treated business as a shared purpose, not a competition. It was everything the modern corporate world had forgotten, and it shook Michael to his core. Before coming to the Philippines, Michael was what most would call the perfect CEO. He lived by the numbers, breathed efficiency, worshipped growth. He prided himself on working 16-hour days and firing anyone who couldn't keep up. Success was his religion, and profit was his proof. But when his third company collapsed, not because of market forces but because of burnout, resentment, and a culture of fear, something inside him broke. "We had the best minds," he would later admit, "but we lost our hearts." He realized his company didn't fail from competition. It failed from compassion deficit. It was during that dark season that one of his investors, a Filipino-American named David Cruz, suggested something unusual. "Come to Manila," he said. "See how we do things there. You might find what you're missing." Michael laughed at first. What could the Philippines possibly teach me about leadership? But after months of insomnia, anxiety, and disillusionment, he took the flight. Not because he believed, but because he had nothing left to lose. The moment his plane descended over Manila Bay, Michael noticed something strange. The city below shimmered with contradictions. Skyscrapers beside shanties, traffic jams that looked like chaos. And yet, there was rhythm in the movement. There was life in the noise. The streets didn't hum with exhaustion, they pulsed with resilience. He saw smiles, not the polite kind, but the genuine ones, like small acts of defiance against hardship. He didn't know it yet, but he had just landed in a place where business and humanity were not enemies, but allies. When he arrived at his new satellite office in Makati, he expected the usual corporate stiffness, quiet employees glued to their screens, a climate of silent competition. Instead, he walked into a room filled with laughter, people chatting, helping one another, sharing lunch from the same containers. They called each other ate and kuya, big sister, big brother, even if they weren't related. They prayed together before meetings. They thanked God after deadlines. They treated every project like a shared mission, not a job. To Michael, it felt bizarre, too warm, too unguarded. He wondered if they were naive. But slowly, something began to change. Days turned into weeks, and he noticed results coming in, faster, cleaner, better. There were no shouting matches, no toxic rivalries, no cold silences. The team moved as one body, each person looking out for the other. It wasn't the culture of cutthroat ambition he was used to, yet somehow it worked. When he asked Liza, the local manager, how she kept morale so high, she smiled and said, "Sir, people work harder when they feel cared for." Simple words, profound truth. That night, sitting in his apartment overlooking the city lights, Michael felt a strange mix of disbelief and humility. Could it be that the West, with all its universities, consultants, and leadership theories, had missed something so basic? Could it be that compassion, the very quality dismissed as weakness, was actually the foundation of sustainable success? He didn't know it yet. But the Philippines was about to answer that question, not through theories, but through lives. And soon, the world would begin to listen. When Michael first stepped out of Ninoy Aquino International Airport, the humidity hit him like a wall, and the sound of Manila wrapped around him like a song he didn't yet understand. Jeepneys rumbled past, painted in every color of imagination. Street vendors called out with voices full of life. It was messy, loud, alive. To a man who had spent decades in polished boardrooms and sterile offices where emotions were muted and every minute was monetized, this chaos felt like another planet. Yet beneath the noise, he sensed something he hadn't felt in years: warmth. There was humanity in the air, raw and unapologetic. And though he didn't admit it then, something in him softened that day. His first week at the Manila office tested every assumption he'd ever had about leadership. Meetings didn't start with numbers, they started with laughter. Deadlines were serious, but birthdays were sacred. People worked hard, but not as if they were trying to prove something, as if they were protecting something. During his first meeting, he noticed how Liza, the local manager, addressed every employee by name. She listened without interrupting. When disagreements arose, she never raised her voice. Instead, she'd say gently, "Let's take a breath. We're still one team." Michael watched, half impressed, half skeptical. To him, leadership had always meant control, precision, authority. This looked almost parental. But the results spoke differently. Tasks were done ahead of schedule. Clients were happier than ever. His investors noticed it too. "Whatever you're doing there, keep doing it," one texted. Michael smiled. But deep inside, he couldn't explain why it worked. He tried to replicate his old management style at first: rigid timelines, strict accountability, the kind of pressure that used to get results back home. But something strange happened. The energy in the room faded. The laughter that filled the hallways disappeared. People became quieter, less creative, less alive. Productivity dipped. He was confused. It made no sense. So he backed off. And when he did, the light came back. People smiled again. They stayed late not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was as if compassion itself fueled their performance. One Friday evening, as Michael prepared to leave the office, a storm began to brew. Dark clouds rolling over the skyline, winds howling through Makati's high-rises. By midnight, it had turned into one of the strongest typhoons to hit the city that year. Roads flooded. Power went out. Michael assumed work would be canceled for days. But when he arrived at the office the next morning, still jet-lagged and drenched, he was stunned. His team was already there, barefoot, rolling up their jeans, drying out equipment with towels. The electricity was down, but they had laptops running on backup power. One of the engineers was brewing instant coffee on a small gas stove. Someone was playing music from their phone. There was laughter, the kind that refuses to die. Michael stared in disbelief. "Why are you here?" he asked, trying to hide his frustration. "We can't even work right now." A young man looked up and said, "Sir, the storm tested our systems. And our spirit. We just wanted to make sure we both survived." Those words landed like thunder. Tested our spirit. He'd never heard a phrase like that in Silicon Valley. No one there talked about spirit. They talked about survival of the fittest. But here, survival meant something different. It meant solidarity. As the weeks passed, he began to see what he called the quiet power of the Filipino workforce. They didn't lead with ego, but with empathy. When someone was sick, others covered their tasks without being asked. When someone's parent died, they pooled money for the funeral without hesitation. It wasn't policy, it was instinct. Michael realized that his people weren't just employees. They were a family disguised as a company. They didn't separate emotion from professionalism because, to them, humanity wasn't a distraction from work. It was the reason to work, but not everyone understood. Back in the United States, some of his peers began to criticize his approach. "You're getting too soft," one investor warned. "You can't run a global business on feelings." Michael didn't argue. He simply invited them to visit. "Come to Manila," he said. "See for yourself?" They didn't come. Not yet. But deep down, Michael knew something was happening. Something that went beyond management style or productivity metrics. It was cultural, spiritual even. He started asking questions, not about profit, but about people. Why did they care so much for one another? Why did they stay optimistic even when life was hard? Liza once told him, "Sir, we grew up knowing that tomorrow might not be easier, so we make today lighter for each other." That answer haunted him. He had spent decades chasing a future that never arrived, while these people found joy in the present, no matter how imperfect it was. The more time he spent in the Philippines, the more he began to see the hidden wealth of this nation. Not gold, not oil, not resources, but heart. Heart that endured typhoons, heartbreak, poverty, yet still smiled. Heart that showed up to work not because of paychecks, but because of purpose. He started to wonder, have we in the West lost this? In chasing progress, have we forgotten people? Could the Philippines, long dismissed as a service economy, actually be a moral economy, the prototype for what compassionate business looks like? That question lingered in him like a prayer. And as he stared out one night over the glowing skyline of Manila, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is where the future begins. Not in another Silicon Valley, but here, among people who remember what it means to care." It began with a question that wouldn't leave his mind. How can a nation so humble, so often overlooked, be so quietly powerful? The more Michael looked for answers, the more he realized he had to go beyond Manila's glass towers and see the country as it really was, raw, human, and alive. He started traveling, to Cebu, to Davao, to Iloilo. each city revealing another layer of a truth that no business school had ever taught him. In Cebu, he visited a call center that had become famous for its low attrition rates. When he asked the manager, a woman named Marites, how she kept her people so loyal, she smiled and said, "We don't manage them, sir. We care for them." He thought it was a charming exaggeration. But then she invited him to the team's morning huddle. They began not with targets, not with charts, but with a short prayer for patience and understanding. "Because patience builds peace," she explained. That sentence hit him like a revelation. For the first time, he saw business as a spiritual act, not religious in ritual, but moral in essence. Every decision, every interaction was an extension of kindness. From there, he traveled to Davao, where he met a small tech startup run by a group of university friends. They worked out of a one-room office with peeling walls, broken air conditioning, and a hand-painted quote above the door, "We rise by lifting others." Their software wasn't revolutionary, but their culture was. Every Friday, they pooled part of their earnings to feed street children, not as charity, as gratitude. One of them, a young man named Carlo, told him, "Sir, when business grows, it should make hearts grow too. Otherwise, it's just noise." Michael couldn't help but think of the boardrooms back home, where billions were traded and no one smiled. Here, in a humid room filled with laughter and hope, he saw something priceless, joy that didn't depend on wealth. Then came Iloilo. There, in a rural BPO hub, he met employees who commuted 2 hours each way just to work. Yet they showed up early, dressed neatly, and treated clients from across the world like family. During lunch breaks, they shared meals with local children outside the office, splitting what little they had. When Michael asked why, a woman replied, "Because, sir, if we have enough to share, that means we are already blessed." That word, blessed, echoed in his mind long after he left. He realized that the Philippines had redefined prosperity in a way no economy report could capture. Wealth wasn't measured in accounts. It was measured in compassion. One evening, in a small chapel near Makati, Michael met a priest named Father Raphael. They spoke about business over a cup of black coffee. The priest listened quietly as Michael confessed that he'd built companies, but lost peace. After a long silence, Father Raphael said, "Maybe you built businesses on profit, not on purpose. Here, people start with purpose. That's why even when we lose, we win." Michael felt his throat tighten. For years, he'd built his identity on winning. Market share, headlines, recognition. But sitting there, under the dim light of a flickering candle, he realized that the greatest victory might simply be peace of heart. From that day forward, he began documenting everything: the smiles, the gestures, the small acts of humanity he once dismissed as inefficiencies. He noticed that meetings here began with stories, not spreadsheets, that people apologized sincerely when they made mistakes, not out of fear, but respect. That leadership wasn't a show of dominance, but of service. He saw the janitor staying late to make sure the office looked perfect for the next day. He saw an employee secretly paying for a colleague's lunch because her salary was delayed. He saw a culture where kindness wasn't a department policy. It was DNA. Each story felt like a sermon, each encounter a gentle correction to his old self. He remembered how he used to pride himself on cutting the weak links, how he celebrated ruthless efficiency. But here, strength was measured differently, not by how fast you moved, but by how deeply you cared. He realized he had come to the Philippines to rebuild a company, but found something far more valuable: a mirror showing him what it meant to be human again, One night, standing on his hotel balcony overlooking the glowing skyline, he felt the humid wind brush his face and the faint music of karaoke rising from the streets below. There was laughter, even after a long day's work. The city was alive, imperfect, resilient, a living symbol of joy despite struggle. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "They've turned compassion into a system." It wasn't charity, it wasn't naivety, it was strategy, a kind of human intelligence that Western models had lost in their race for perfection. As he returned to the office the next morning, he called an emergency video conference with his U.S. team. They expected a new operational plan. Instead, he told them, "We're changing everything. From now on, kindness is our first KPI." The team laughed. They thought he was joking, but he wasn't. What started as a cultural experiment soon became the foundation of a global movement. Because what Michael had seen in the Philippines wasn't just a workforce, it was a revelation. Compassion works. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't chasing profit. Profit was chasing him. The nation he once underestimated had just taught him the most advanced business lesson of all. Humanity scales. Months turned into years, and what began as curiosity transformed into conviction. Michael was no longer the outsider observing Filipino culture from a distance. He was living inside it. The longer he stayed, the clearer it became. The secret of the Philippines was not in its resources, not in its technology, not even in its youth. It was in its heart. His company, once struggling, began to thrive in ways that baffled his investors. Productivity soared. Employee turnover dropped to almost zero. Clients spoke about a kind of warmth they could feel even through an email or a call. The same people who had once dismissed the Philippines as a service economy now began to whisper a different phrase: the compassion economy. Michael restructured his company entirely around what he called the Filipino framework. Every new project began with a question: how does this serve people? Every strategy meeting opened with a short reflection on empathy. Fridays became Bayanihan days, when teams worked together on community projects, from planting trees to feeding children. It wasn't PR, it was philosophy. His American headquarters initially pushed back, arguing that this kind of soft approach didn't scale. But the numbers told a different story. Growth tripled. Customer satisfaction hit record highs. Innovation increased. Not because of pressure, but because people felt free to create. They weren't afraid to fail. They were inspired to try. Michael often said, "When you lead with fear, you get obedience. When you lead with compassion, you get brilliance." He was no longer running a company. He was shepherding a movement. The walls of his Manila office were now covered with photos of team members volunteering in hospitals, teaching in rural schools, helping rebuild homes after typhoons. These weren't initiatives forced by management. They were expressions of who they were. And every time he asked why they did it, they always said the same thing: because we can't separate work from love. Those words would later become the tagline of his company. Work with love. What once sounded sentimental now became a symbol of something powerful, a quiet revolution in how business could be human again. The turning point came when Harvard Business School invited him to speak. The same institution that once taught him to chase margins and market share now wanted to understand how a Filipino-inspired business culture had outperformed their traditional models. Standing before a hall of professors, executives, and students, Michael began his talk with a single sentence that made everyone lean forward. The future of business is not artificial intelligence, it's authentic humanity. There was a murmur in the crowd, half disbelief, half awe. He spoke about Liza, about the typhoon, about the laughter that echoed through adversity. He spoke about how kindness became a metric, how prayer became strategy, and how compassion turned into profit. When a professor asked skeptically, "Are you saying kindness is a business model?" Michael smiled and replied, "No, professor. I'm saying it's the only one that lasts." His words went viral. Major networks picked up his story. Global leaders began flying to Manila to see what was happening. In boardrooms across the United States, the Philippines was suddenly not just an outsourcing destination, it was a case study in moral leadership. Journalists began calling it the Manila model. CEOs started visiting his headquarters in Makati to observe how teams functioned. They were shocked to see employees addressing their bosses with warmth, not fear, calling them ate and kuya, symbols of respect and family. They saw prayer circles before product launches, shared laughter after stressful days, and teams that treated clients like friends. They realized that what they were witnessing was not chaos, but harmony, a kind of order built not on control, but on care. One particular afternoon, during a visit from a skeptical venture capitalist, Michael invited him to join the staff canteen for lunch instead of the private dining room. The investor hesitated, but agreed. As they sat on simple chairs, sharing adobo and rice cooked by one of the employees' mothers, laughter filled the room. No one talked about profits, yet every person radiated purpose. The investor watched in silence before whispering, "I've seen billions made in silence, but never this much happiness in noise." Michael smiled. "That's the difference," he said softly. "Here, success sounds like laughter." Soon, global media began calling the Philippines the heart of Asian business. Multinational corporations started to study its work culture. Leadership seminars quoted Filipino values: Bayanihan, collective effort; Malasakit, deep empathy; and pasensya, patience that turns struggle into strength. These words became part of international boardroom vocabulary. The Philippines had not just entered the global conversation, it was redefining it. What once looked like a nation of service providers was now seen as a nation of soul providers, the living embodiment of compassionate capitalism. And yet, amidst all the attention, Michael remained humble. He often said, "I didn't create this model, I just paid attention." He knew that what he had found in the Philippines wasn't a new theory. It was an ancient truth, one the world had forgotten. A truth passed down in families that prayed before meals, in mothers who worked overseas to give their children better lives, in strangers who smiled through pain. The world called it innovation. But in truth, it was simply the Filipino way of life. One night, as the city lights shimmered beneath a soft drizzle, Michael walked alone through Bonifacio Global City. He saw street cleaners chatting after their shift, a security guard sharing food with a beggar, a child singing karaoke off-key but full of joy. He paused and whispered to himself, This is what humanity looks like when it refuses to give up." For the first time in years, he felt complete. He wasn't chasing growth anymore. He was witnessing grace. And he finally understood that true transformation doesn't begin in systems, it begins in hearts. Years later, Michael stood on a quiet veranda overlooking Tall Lake. The mist rolled gently over the water, and the sound of a distant rooster echoed from the hills. It had been almost a decade since that first bewildering flight to Manila. He was no longer the man who measured worth by stock prices or leadership by fear. He had retired from his company, but not from his calling. For he knew that what the Philippines had given him was far more than profit. It was peace. A journalist once asked him, "Why didn't you go back to California? Surely the comforts of home must be calling you?" Michael smiled, eyes soft but steady. "Because here," he said, "business still remembers its soul." That line became a headline in the Wall Street Journal the next week. But to Filipinos, it wasn't news. It was truth. They had always known that compassion isn't weakness, it's wisdom. In a land battered by storms, rebuilt by faith, and carried by laughter, kindness isn't an accessory, it's armor. Through centuries of hardship, colonization, and migration, the Filipino heart learned to bend, but never to break. And that heart, Michael realized, was exactly what the modern world had lost in its race for dominance. The Philippines had built a quiet empire, not of wealth or weapons, but of warmth. Michael's company lived on, run entirely by his Filipino leadership team. They continued expanding across continents, exporting not just services, but values. In New York, London, and Singapore, people began using words like Malasakit, deep care and empathy, in board meetings. Foreign CEOs started visiting Filipino offices, not for outsourcing, but for insight. They wanted to know how these people managed to stay so joyful, so united, even under pressure. They wanted to understand how kindness had become their competitive edge. And every time they asked, the answer was simple: because we see people before we see positions. On a visit to his old alma mater, Stanford University, Michael was invited to deliver a lecture. He walked into the same hall where decades earlier he'd been taught that profit is the purpose of business. This time he opened with a different creed. Profit sustains a company, but compassion sustains the world. He spoke of how he'd seen Filipino employees stay late to help teammates finish tasks, how they'd rebuild offices after storms, how they'd pray not for promotions, but for patience. The students were silent. When he finished, one young man raised his hand and asked, "So are you saying the future of capitalism is Filipino?" Michael chuckled softly and said, "No, I'm saying the future of capitalism will only survive if it learns from the Filipino." His words rippled through the academic world. Business magazines began calling the Philippines the soul of modern capitalism. Harvard researchers published case studies on the compassionate management model, tracing its origins to Filipino culture. But for Michael, the validation didn't matter. What mattered were the faces, the quiet smiles, the laughter during storms, the warmth that made him feel human again. He often said that the Philippines didn't teach him how to do business. It taught him how to belong. One morning, while walking through a local market in Tagaytay, a young vendor recognized him from a viral speech and asked, "Sir, is it true that American CEOs call our country the future of business?" Michael nodded and said, "Yes, but not just any business, the business of compassion." The vendor laughed and handed him a bag of mangoes. "Then, sir," he said, "maybe the world is finally learning what we've known all along." Michael smiled, realizing that the wisdom he had spent his whole life chasing had always been here, in the people, in their patience, in their unwavering belief that faith and work are not separate things, but one continuous act of love. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Michael sat quietly, watching children play by the roadside, their laughter floating like a hymn in the wind. He thought of all the countries he had visited, the glass towers of Hong Kong, the trading floors of London, the deserts of Dubai, and none of them felt as alive as this small, radiant nation in the Pacific. He whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for success, but for second chances. "Thank you," he said softly, "for reminding me what matters." Today, when American CEOs talk about the future of compassionate business, they may not realize it, but they're speaking the language of this nation. They're talking about Bayanihan, the collective spirit of lifting one another. They're talking about mabuhay, the celebration of life even in adversity. They're talking about pasensya, the grace of patience that keeps hope alive. These are not just words. They are the rhythm of a people who have learned to thrive with open hearts. And in a world growing colder by the minute, the Philippines shines as proof that kindness still scales, faith still leads, and compassion still wins. So to every Filipino watching this, remember, the world is finally seeing what you've always known. You are not just workers, not just citizens, not just survivors. You are teachers. You are the living reminder that progress without empathy is poverty in disguise. And to everyone else, wherever you are, listen closely. Because the next great revolution won't come from algorithms or automation. It will come from humanity rediscovered, from leaders who choose to care, and from a nation that never stopped believing in goodness. Somewhere in the heart of the Pacific, in a place the world once underestimated, a quiet truth is rising. The Philippines is not just the future of compassionate business. It is the proof that compassion itself is the greatest business of all.